So let's get it started. Yeah, well, thank you so much for who already, sort of staying from the our mental health symposium. This will be something different, very personal, but good afternoon. Welcome to the Museum of Chinese in America. My name is Yifan Wu. When I stay there, I'm the director of programs and just head here in the museum. So it is my pleasure to welcome you to a very special conversation this afternoon with Curtis Chen, author of the award-winning memoir, Island in a Chinese restaurant. And then, very special occasion because, right, this is, since the hardcover copy release has really won numerous awards, and then recently, paperback version comes out. So then, feel free to all the paperback, you will buy one, and then it's actually available for sale for $18. And we can accept the credit cards, and then thermal PayPal donations, and then you will get an autograph by Curtis after the conversation.
Makes a great Christmas gift.
Exactly. Yeah. Add it to your list, right? So, but then just a little bit about sort of the book, and then but then the conversation. So Curtis will actually share his experiences growing up as a gay Chinese American in the 1980 Detroit, framed by life at his family's beloved Cantonese restaurant, Chung's. His memoir captures a powerful journey of self-discovery during a time marked by rising xenophobia, the AIDS crisis, and the shifting social and political climate of the Reagan era, illustrating how these challenges shaped his identity as a writer and activist. So as a filmmaker and co-founder of Asian American Writers Workshop, Curtis has dedicated his career to exploring cultural identity, community, and social justice through storytelling. So, as I mentioned, in celebration of the paperback release of his memoir, Curtis has also organized a series of events at beloved Chinese restaurants across the country, sharing their stories and discussing their histories and challenges. You can actually learn more at Curtis from Detroit.com. I know, I think it's probably already sold out, but actually his New York stop is going to be on Wednesday night at right? Yeah, if there's a wait list, maybe it will cancel, right? But then, and of course, if you enjoy this afternoon program, right, this one, and then the mental health symposium, please consider supporting MOCA. Your donations will help us to create more programs, free and low-cost programs to the communities. As I mentioned, the book is available for sale, and then please procure a copy after the conversation. And also for our live participants, we also encourage you to submit questions anytime during the discussion. And also these programs also being recorded for our on-demand viewings at our YouTube channel. So thank you again tonight, for joining us. Actually, so without further ado, so I'm going to hand it over to Curtis, as he will actually give us an introduction, a quick introduction to the book, to the Pink family, to the beloved restaurants, and some of the scenes in his book. So can we give a round of
Okay.
Oh, microphone is better for the live. Nice.
Okay. 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 Hello. Okay. I'm going to see if I can hold the book while I read. But anyway, thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Yifan. Thank you, Michael, for inviting me to come back to MOCA. I told them that I actually have a long history with this organization. I actually was an intern at MOCA when it was still the Chinatown History Project in 1990. So how long ago was that? 34 years ago? 34 years ago? What? 44?
Oh, 1990s.
34. I'm not that old, Michael. Come on. So,
the museum was founded in 1980s. 40.
Okay, so I was here in 1990. I was here in 1990. I was here right at the beginning, or the dawn of time. Okay, so anyway, I'm the author of the memoir, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. And as the title says, I grew up in a Chinese restaurant, but not just any Chinese restaurant. I like to think of it as the Chinese restaurant in Detroit. And the way I sort of gauge that is I ask people to guess how many egg rolls you think we sold in the 60 years that we own this business. Any guesses?
Millions.
Oh yeah, you read the book, you can't guess. These are all handmade, even the skin and the sauce. My mom, my grandma, my aunts, they all, worked tirelessly.
How long was the restaurant?
65 years.
65 years, so 65, let's say you sold.
6 million? We sold over 10 million egg rolls.
Ah.
A real yeah. Well, the reason I get the place to go is because my family was there and we got all this free food. But at the same time, Detroit, my hometown, was going through a lot of difficulties. The auto industry was struggling. There was crack cocaine, there was AIDS. I knew 5 people murdered by the time I was 18 years old, including Vincent Chin. My uncle was his best man. And so it was a really, really difficult time. But at the same time, my family, provided this really wonderful place for me and my siblings to really discover who we were, and what we wanted in life. And so for me, writing this book isn't just, recounting all the mischievous things that I did in the back of that Chinese restaurant, but it's also a thank you to my parents for providing me and my siblings wonderful lives. And it's also a hat to my hometown of Detroit, because I think that people still kind of misunderstand the city. And I wanted to show that Detroit was still capable of producing good things, like me. So that is the book. I'm going to just read a little bit from the beginning to get us kickstarted, and then when E5 joins, I'll read a little bit more. But I did want to start off just talking a little bit about my family and our journey to Michigan, because I think a lot of times when you think about the story of the Chinese Americans, you really think of the East Coast or the West Coast. You don't think of Asians being, in the middle of the country, but that's where we were. And so I really wanted to sort of highlight that at the beginning. Also because I think that you can't really know a person's journey unless you know where their family came from, because so much of the things that you want and things you hope for are really dictated by them. And so I'm just going to start off and read a little bit from the prologue. Welcome to Chung's. Is this for here to go? Armed with a smile and a red waiter's jacket with a perpetual plum sauce stain. That's how my dad greeted any new face who entered the lobby of our popular Chinese restaurant in Detroit. Interestingly, my great-great-grandpa, Gong Li, had faced the same question in the late 1800s as he stood cold and alone on a rickety dock in Guangzhou, China, trying to decide his future and that of his young impoverished family. For here to go. For here to go, as I got older, it was a question I asked myself. Starting in our restaurant's long and open back kitchen, where my family made some of our more popular items, including the tangiest barbecue pork and best smelling almond cookies, my mom taught me my first lessons. Before diving into math, English, and geography, she began with a little American history, tales of elders and ancestors, our family as prologue. And so what the rest of the prologue does, it just follows that journey of my great-great-grandfather, Gong Li Chin. I talked about how he moved from Canton, China to Canton, Ohio, before realizing there weren't actually Chinese people there, and then moving up to Detroit. The auto industry was just kicking off at that time. He tried to get a job in the factory, but because of discrimination, he couldn't get a job there. So he took what was one of the few opportunities available to those early Chinese immigrants, which was doing the hand laundry. And so luckily he worked really hard and he saved up enough money, because when the United States enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act, there was 2 exceptions for that. One was if you were a student, and the second is if you owned a business. And because he owned a business, he was able to bring over his son, and then subsequently his grandson, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how my family was able to, make it in this country for such a long time. And so the prologue just sort of continues with that journey. We go through, like Depression, World War II, all that kind of stuff, and it ends in the 60s. And at that time in the country, there was a lot of racial strife because of the civil rights movement. Cities were being burnt down in Detroit. People were actually being killed in the streets, and the National Guard had to be called in to sort of quell the violence. And for the first time ever, my parents actually had to close the restaurant for 5 straight days. But during those 5 days, my parents also found time to have sex. And so 9 months later, I was born as their riot baby. So sometimes people ask me, well, why do you talk about racial justice and equality so much? And I say, well, without that incident, I probably wouldn't be around. So it's in my DNA. And so that is the book. It was published by Little Brown in October last year, and I'm happy to report it's already in its 3rd printing. And I've done over 2 times at a World Book Talk tour, including most in the U.S., but also in 5 or 6 other countries. My hometown. The best part has been the reception that I've gotten from my hometown, my home state of Michigan. They just announced 2 weeks ago that they picked it for what's called the Great Michigan Read. They choose 1 book every 2 years and then they buy 6,000 copies and they give it away free to every school and library. And why that's so important to me, because obviously as a young Asian kid, you grow up in these schools and you don't see your own history, you don't see your family's history in these books, right, that they're teaching. But the fact that now my book is going to be in every learning institution in the state makes me feel really good that if you're a young Asian kid, you can see that we have a long history in that state. But on top of that, I've done the keynote for the Michigan Historical Society. The state library picked my book as a notable book last year, and most importantly, I've gotten to give talks to Ford Motor Company, Pistons, and the Lions. And the Lions have said that anytime I come home, I get ticket seats to their box seat. So if you're ever a football fan and you want to get free football tickets, write a book. Oh, that's your best way to get free tickets. And so that's the exciting thing. So for the paperback, as was announced, I'm doing a special thing. I want to use the platform that I developed because of the book, the success of the book, to sort of support the community. Because as I've been traveling around, I've been hearing all these stories about these really venerable Chinese restaurants that have been closing. Like in fact, just last week, the Lucky Inn, restaurant in St. Louis that was opened in 1932, just announced that they had to close down because torrential rain destroyed the building like a couple weeks ago, and it's now a condemned building. And now that restaurant's going to be gone. You know what I mean? And so we have this whole generation of those restaurants from the 30s, 40s, and 50s that are disappearing. Even in my own family, my family owned the oldest restaurant, for a while. But then when my dad passed away, we had to sell it. But then his cousin was still operating the oldest restaurant that was opened in 1953. And the matriarch just passed away this past year at the age of 94, and they're about to close that restaurant too. So I felt like if there's something I can do with this book to sort of help these other ones, at least, stay along for a little bit longer, and then maybe things will get better, and that maybe this part of history is something that, we can find a way to have the next generation take over or whatever. And so I'm doing 14 Chinese restaurants all across the United States. The one that I'm doing here in New York is going to be at Hop Key. It's on Wednesday. Unfortunately, it's already sold out. But tomorrow morning, I'm going up to China Pearl up in Boston. If anybody here is from Boston, they were closed during COVID, but they're reopening. So it's a fight, and so I can help in any way. I'm happy to do that. So, but today we're here to talk about the book. So would love to have Yifan join me, and then we can talk. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, for the lovely introduction. So my first question, right, kind of like just as most of us, right, first time reading the book, even the title, right, everything I learned in restaurant. So what did you learn?
Okay. So, well, I have to say the first thing that I learned is probably the most important lesson I learned from my dad is that, when you're a little kid, oftentimes parents will say, like, don't talk to strangers. My parents gave me the exact opposite advice. They were like, talk to strangers, right? Not those creepy people in vans, but, like the people sitting in their dining room. And what they were basically saying, my mom, who didn't have a chance to, graduate high school because she got married, arranged marriage, and had to start working in the restaurant. My dad had to drop out of community college also to work in the restaurant. I didn't necessarily know what opportunities existed outside of that four walls. But my dad, saw that we had this whole dining room people did. And so anytime, he met somebody who thought had a cool job, he'd call all six of his kids to run over and just barrage them with questions of, what do you do for a living? How'd you get your job? How much money do you make? And from that, it just taught me, like, the most fundamental thing in life is, like, don't be afraid of people that are different from you, right? Don't be afraid of asking questions. And most importantly, don't be afraid of asking for help if you need it. And so I feel like that's something that's really guided me. And, like, my ability to even be able to travel around and talk to all these people in different venues is because I grew up in a Chinese restaurant.
Right. Well, and then yeah, as also the book mentioned, right, like Chung was actually a haven really for a really diverse group of people, right, from city residents to drag queens to even the mayor of the time. So how did kind of your experience sort of this mix of constituents, customers really shape sort of your understanding of community? Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's the best part about the restaurant, right? Is that we really did see all these diverse customers, and they're all the top of the book. Like the first mayor, drag queens, Oscar-winning actors, like everybody showed up at our restaurant. So that's one of the fun parts of writing the book is like showing that diversity. But
customers are really, really special to us. And this is something that sort of happened, when I was traveling around doing this talk, is that I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at Porter Square Books. And at the end of it, this 60-year-old white woman gets up and she's like, has anybody here eaten at Chung's? Right? And nobody had because we're in Massachusetts. But she said, I grew up in Detroit. My family went there every Sunday. It was like our favorite restaurant, right? And then when she told her mom that she was going to this reading by one of the kids from Chung's, her mom, who has dementia now, started recounting all of our dishes in vivid details, right? And that just really touched me because food is so important to all of our memories. And they actually say that like when you get older and you start losing your faculties, the last thing to go is your taste and your smell, right? Because those are probably the most fundamental senses that we need. But to me, growing up in that restaurant, I always understood that my parents were doing it to help our family and to get them, enough money to get college education to like go off and succeed in life. But what I didn't realize is that they were also doing it for the city of Detroit. Because at that time, Detroit was literally burning down, right? Like everything was just falling apart in the city. But what they were doing is they were providing this little oasis for the community, put a top and have a good meal. And in a city that's really literally, being knocked down left and right, that was really important. And so that idea of community that you talk about is like so important. And I just really appreciate that what my family did, not just for our family, but what they were trying to do for the city is just really, really touching me.
And then you mentioned you really pretty much spent much of your childhood, right, at Chance, and then kind of working even from waiter to host to security, but then so how was that experience of, like different roles shape your perspective, in life, yeah.
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, like everybody thinks of like when you grow up in a Chinese restaurant, everybody thinks of the kitchen, right? Because that's the fun part, right? In my family, I was like the worst cook, right? So whenever everybody said it was time to cook something, I was like banished to the dining room to go set the table. So it's my understanding of what a Chinese restaurant is, like mostly the dining room. And one of the lessons that I learned early on was that, we all have ideas of where we want to be in life. For me, I wanted to be in the kitchen, but sometimes we're not allowed to be in those places, right? And so we have to make the best of the places that we are put in. And so for me, I thought like, well, if I can't be a great cook, I'm going to be the best waiter that I can. And so it just really forced me to think like, you know what? You always have to make the best of the situation you have. You can't just gripe and say, like, oh, I wish I were there. You can look for it, but where you're at is where you're at. For me, it's like I'm going to be the best damn waiter I could be, and I did a pretty good job. I always got the most tips, so I think I learned a thing or two.
Yeah, I said I want to skip it, right? Even though restaurant setting, there's always something that will be kind of fitting, you'll find your best skill at. So then, but at one point, right, you kind of assume, right, like sort of your life would be like your father and grandparents of spending, right, sort of you wrestle at France, but. So my question here would be like, what changed that trajectory for you?
Well, and okay, so yeah, I always thought that I would be a waiter because that's the job that I had starting as 14 years old. I thought, like, okay, this is a pretty good life. I mean, it's a great restaurant. We have steady customers. Like I said, delicious food. I was like, that was going to be my life. But then, where I went from being a waiter to a writer. See how I did that? Waiter, writer. Was when I was 14 years old, and it was actually the Vincent Chin murder case. So what happened with that was that I was in middle school, about to enter high school, and you guys don't know the Vincent Chin murder case, everybody? Does anybody here not know the case? Because if you don't know, I'll mention it. Okay, so in the 80s, it was the height of the anti-Japanese sentiment in Detroit and around the country. Vincent was a Chinese American who was out celebrating his upcoming wedding. He goes to the strip club. At some point, these two white auto workers come in. They're overheard saying it's because of Mother Blanks that we're out of work. They're all kicked out of the bar. And the two guys, these two auto workers, literally get in their car and they drive around the streets of Detroit until they see Vincent sitting outside of McDonald's waiting for his car to pick him up. They take a baseball bat out of the backseat of their car and they bash his head in. And, because our families were close, like I said, we found out that very next morning, that Saturday, he was in the hospital, struggling for his life. And you know, when you're a 14-year-old kid and you know somebody that's in that situation, you're going to check the newspapers, right? You're going to check the TV, you're going to check the radio to see how they're reporting on it. Nobody reported on it. You know, the next day I checked again, nothing. Next day after that, nothing. Nothing, nothing, nothing. I mean, it took them 12 whole days for the media to actually cover that story. But in the meantime, everybody in Chinatown was coming to our restaurant, you know, not just because we had the gambling den in our basement, but they were coming because they wanted to know like the news of what was going on and, you know, what happened. And so that contrast between what the mainstream media was covering and what our community cared about really stuck out at me, especially several months later when the judge came back with the sentence. He basically charged them $3,000 and they didn't have to serve a single day in jail. And his rationale is that you don't put these type of people in jail, meaning white middle class people. You know, and for me, you know, my family's raised Buddhist. I don't, you know, I don't have. I'm not upset that he showed compassion to the killers because I have some compassion for them too. I don't think they meant to start their day off and kill somebody. But I think the fact that he had no compassion for Vincent and his family, I think is the problem. He had no compassion for Vincent's fiance, you know, and I think if he'd taken that perspective, he might have come up with a different, you know, just sentencing. And so for me as a 14-year-old kid, what I did was, you know, I started, you know, realizing that it was really important for us as a community to tell our stories so that when people see us, you know, when these terrible things happen, they can understand that we're people, right? That we deserve justice too. And so I was determined to sort of like maybe be one of those people. And so I loved the typewriter. You know, typewriter. Yeah. So I really appreciate this. Okay. I brought the typewriter to the dining room, and I just started writing these letters to the editor. You know, but you know, none of them ever got published. But you know, that sort of you know started my way in terms of you know the idea of writing, you know, and telling our stories is something that's important, literally, for life that matters. Yeah.
And I feel like this is also the case, right? Kind of, you know, for somebody right after the case, right? There's really be the national kind of outcry, right? Really sort of highlighted sort of the disparities, right, in like how Asian American stories are told in mainstream media, and then that's really right, folks, you know. And I know you're also like one of the producers for the documentary Vincent Wu, right? And then also there's also one partners in Vincent Chung related.
Yeah, we got over there, everybody.
But for me, more importantly, it's why I came to New York at that right after graduating college. Right? I could talk about my college if you want, but after college, I moved here to New York. I moved here to New York and I co-founded a group called the Asian American Writers Workshop. Hopefully, you guys have had a chance to participate in some of the programming. You know, but it was following that idea that like we need to get our stories out. We need to be able to tell as many of our stories so that when something terrible happens, sadly, you know, people will see us as people. You know? And so that was the whole, you know. So I mean, the Writers Workshop inspires like to things you this.
I mean, we'll go into sort of the later kind of the you know like the New York kind of chapter, and then I would want to you know kind of ask one last question about the chance, right? This book doesn't really go into much detail about the closing events. Could you tell us a little bit more, you know, why it was closed and how did it impact you and your family?
Well, I mean that's actually the next book I'm working on. So basically, what happened was that you know, I came to New York, and then I eventually I left New York because I met a boy who was living in LA, and then you know found myself writing for television out there. And so in 2005, I was writing for the Disney Channel. Don't ask me what show, but I was writing for the Disney Channel. Anyway, I was writing for TV, and then I get this terrible phone call that my parents were in a car accident back home in Detroit, and sadly my dad passed away. And my brother Chris, who's like the golden child in the book, you know, he fortunately became a doctor in Los Altos, California. He immediately whisks my mom off to the Bay Area to help her recuperate. And by the end of that first week, my 4 other siblings all decided they were also going to move out to California to help my mom. And I was sort of stuck back in Detroit trying to decide, like, well, do I go back to Hollywood and continue pursuing that career, or do I stay in Detroit and take over the family business? And so that's the next book I'm working on, and it's called Leftovers. So yeah, so that was the impact, and it's been really sad. But just to show you how iconic that restaurant is, that building has been empty for 20 years. It recently got sold last year, and this new building owner has pumped in like $3.5 million into its renovation. It's all part of like what's going on in Detroit right now. There's a lot of gentrification going on. But that owner went through the trouble of tracking me down in LA, asking me if I would reopen our family business. I mean, it is that iconic. Like even when I gave my talk to the Pistons said we're doing a special jersey, for next year. That's at Chung's restaurant. And everybody here still remembers. These are really, every city kind of has restaurants that everybody remembers. And so, Chung's, because it was open for so long and because it made it through toughest years in our city, I think that that's why some. Yeah.
So would you consider reopening it if the offer is right?
Oh God, when that guy called, I like thought about it really hard for like 5 seconds. I was like, no, I can't do that. And God, but I keep floating the idea. Like there was just another article because I keep getting asked this question, but then I keep floating in the press. Like if someone wanted me to be involved as like a consultant or something, I'd be happy to help out. But I can't go back and run a restaurant. But if you want to, bring me in to sort of help you shape the menu and maybe talk about the design of the place and maybe give me a 5% cut or something, we totally up with that. But nobody's taking me up on that offer yet. So.
Partnership, but then hopefully with your tour, right? Kind of add local, things to restaurants to be able to, galvanize, kind of more interest.
We'll see. I mean, like I said, this whole state has just really, really embraced the book. I mean, we'll see. I mean, they're going to put me on a tour of the state, and they're going to, so maybe they will do that. I mean, there's so much happening in Detroit. It's really, really exciting. But I want to be a part of it. But I also have to recognize that I don't live there anymore, so I can only have so much of a say.
Yeah, and then as you mentioned, kind of Detroit right now is kind of have a lot of sort of urban development, sort of having its own renaissance, but I want to kind of go back and look at sort of the 80s and 90s, right? Because Detroit really sort of I feel like as reading is feels like a character in your book, right?
Yes.
And then so how can you I know you already briefly talk about in your production, but then how really did growing up in the 1980 Detroit, like with kind of very unique challenges, really influence your identity and what.
Well, I mean, I think that overall, when you're growing up in a city that is constantly falling apart, I mean, that inevitably shapes your view of the world, right? I mean, but I think because of the unique circumstances of my family and that restaurant, it really did save me, and it allowed me to continue being optimistic in a city that's probably is pessimistic. So, if you don't mind, I'd like to read, the chapter now about this, a little excerpt. So just to set this up, a big part of writing this book is not just about my own memoir. It really is for my mom, because my mom really sacrificed a lot for us as kids. And I just really wanted to write this book for her too, and to tell her story. So I'm going to read this story that sort of happens in the third section during my college years. And sort of to set this up for you all, is that this is the 80s. This is the the height of or the beginning of the AIDS, epidemic, where people were literally dying, and as a closeted gay kid, I didn't think I, had a lot of, very long life expectancy because of that, particularly because also during my senior year, one of our favorite customers told us, came in all the time at weird hours by himself, told us he was the ER doctor. It turned out he was actually a famous psychiatrist who would come to our restaurant to hire come to our area to hire the prostitutes in the neighborhood. And he was trying to break off with this one girl, and the pimp got so upset that he also took a baseball bat and bashed in his head in. And then he chopped up his body with a Ginsu knife and littered it all across the freeway up to northern Michigan. And so that was like my senior year. Yeah, think about that. Institute was my freshman year, now with my senior year. So I didn't understand the point of going to college because I literally thought I'd be dead by the end of the decade. Like I thought like maybe 30 years of life, that's what happens in Riverdale neighborhoods. My mom really wanted us to go to college. She felt like that was the key. She'd always said to us growing up, like, work hard, obey your elders, be quiet. Like that was the mantra that she just like constantly, repeated to us. And so I rationalized what would be me giving up 4 years of my life to a woman that's given up her whole life for me? So I said, okay, I made a deal with my mom. I said, okay, I'll apply to college, but I'll only apply to one school. And if I don't get it, I'm not going. And if I like it, fine, you'll apply to Michigan. And so I applied to Michigan, and sadly, I got it. So going to college, I was one of those kids that actually had to work full time, and I went to school at night. And then at night, they have a lot of classes in creative writing for some reason. I don't know why, but so that's when I said, okay, well, I'll take these creative writing classes, and I did the math, and I said, okay, if I studied poetry writing, and if I only wrote haikus, I could graduate in fewer than 500 words. That was my whole goal. Graduating college. And then I guess luckily I wrote a really mean haiku because I got into the creative writing program at U of M, a program that only took 20 students. And so this story sort of comes from that, if I can find it. I really can't. Yeah, thanks. Okay. Okay, so one thing is that you're supposed to read the book as if it's like going to a meal at a Chinese restaurant. That's what the opening line is, like what my dad says. When you enter, the closing line is like, please come again. So all the chapter numbers are like a Chinese menu, so that's why they made it make sense. But this is chapter M7. Okay. Being a creative writing major made me the literary expert at Chung's. That was inevitable, as my dad asked every customer, "Have you met our number 3? He's the writer in the family." Every time he mentioned my program, the number of students accepted got smaller and smaller. At some point, I expected him to say I was the only one on campus, even allowed to own a pen. One week, one of our waiters was out sick. My younger siblings were busy with their weekend activities, so I was the one called in to help. I jumped at the chance to have some home-cooked meals for a few days. I was running around the dining room, refreshing our customers' silver teapots, when a white middle-aged woman reached into her oversized bag and pulled out a colorful hardcover. "Have you read this book? It's so good." The Joy Luck Club, the recently released novel that featured a bunch of old, sassy Chinese ladies who like to eat, gossip, and play mahjong, could have easily been set in our back kitchen. Every time I came in to help at the restaurant, another diner, usually older and female, cited their most favorite, memorable characters, lines, and scenes. They all wanted to know if I was working on something similar. I was writing poetry, but they didn't care. To them, all writers were the same. They would squeal, "You could be the next Amy Tan." My mom turned out to be the biggest pusher. She rarely had a book in her hand, but the success of the Joy Luck Club convinced her that her life was a bestseller too. She followed me around the dining room, dropping stories from her childhood, the same ones I heard growing up. Now she recounted them as if she was auditioning for her own books on tape. One night, after seeing how our waiters sometimes pooled tips together, my mom shared an oldie. "When the communists marched south, they targeted my family. My uncles and grandpa were rich in America, so the Red Guard called us traitors. My stubborn grandma didn't want to leave her big home, so when my parents escaped to Hong Kong, they left me behind to keep her company. The communists hated me, my pawpaw. When I was 4, they made me watch as they forced my grandma to climb the oak banyan tree in our courtyard. Then they pushed her off into a pile of broken glass." For a visual, my mom rubbed her knees. Another time, standing at the water station, she launched into her own nautical tale. "When I was 5, my uncle in America paid $25,000 in renminbi, a king's ransom in people's money, to local fishermen to ferry our remaining family out of China. After a long ride tucked under the planks of his fishy fishing boat, we came up for air. But we weren't in Hong Kong. The trader turned us into the authorities. In jail, I had to sing Communist Party songs to earn extra rice for me and my grandma." Another chapter came as we stood beneath a painting of the Chinese countryside. "When my papa and I were freed from jail, we found that the officials had given away our home to peasants. We were forced to live several villages away in a dirt hut with 3 other families. Whenever we went out for a pail of water, my grandma had to bend low to keep her head below the soldiers." Once again, she gave me a demonstration, bowing her head. Granted, my mom's epic saga interested me. Who wouldn't be intrigued by tales of prison cells, guns, and stolen ransoms? Even the parts about her mundane life in Hong Kong after she was reunited with her parents and siblings were amusing. These were her stories, not mine. She had to tell them, not me. I was in school to find my own voice. Sat and listened, but that was as far as we would go. Toward the end of the summer, as I was at the back table sipping my red pop, stockpiling poems for the upcoming semester, my mom sat down. Before I could say anything, she started talking. "I was a top student in Hong Kong. When Pepsi came to town, they held a big contest for students to draw a picture of their own school. Mine was the best at Sacred Heart. I won 6 cases. There were so many bottles, I had to give some to the nuns." I threw down my fountain pen, the one I treated myself to after getting into the program. "Yes, and they kept burping all day. It was so funny. Ha ha. Told me that story over and over. I don't even like Pepsi. I prefer Coke." My mom's shoulders shriveled. The shine faded from her rosy cheeks. "You don't want to hear my story?" I tensed up. "I do, but I'm behind on my own stuff." Between working at Drake's, the Journal, and saving the world, my schedule was packed. On top of that, my workshops in the fall were advanced. Still insecure about my place in the program, I put pressure on myself to create more interesting writing by staying up late and scribbling in my notebook every detail of my life. But no matter how hard I tried, working harder could not produce a better poem. My mom lifted herself off her seat. The glint in her eyes orphaned me. 42 years of life flashed before my eyes. She'd gone from Guangzhou to Hong Kong, Detroit, and spent the past 2 decades raising her 6 children in a hostile foreign land. She tried to prove that her life had worth, that it hadn't gone unnoticed, and here I was, the ungrateful son, writing it off. Her lips quivered in a soft murmur. I hastily picked up my pen, backtracking. Go ahead, Mom, I'll write it down this time. My mom bowed her head as if I were one of the soldiers holding a gun to her temple, ordering her to sing. No, you go on. You do your own thing. I reached out my hand, but by then she disappeared through the black swinging door, leaving only the rattling from the kitchen, the clanging walks and rumbling dishwasher. I sat there upset at myself for being so inconsiderate. Everything I had done in the past 3 years had been for her, but it seemed as though I had failed the final test. My education wasn't just to help me get a better life, it was for my whole family. We were a team. We were the 8 immortals. How could I let them down? I needed to make things right, but I knew that, like most disappointments in our house, apologies were never spoken. Only deeds would bring about reconciliation. 30 years, but I finally told her story.
Wow. Well, family, your family. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Because I know this program is part of our the LGBT Q plus series, so I do want to kind of spend the last few minutes of our conversation on the creativity a little bit. So really in the book, right, you really explore those of the multifaceted sort of aspects of your being a queer people of color from a working class background. So how do you, or have you been sort of navigating, how did you navigate that kind of the intersection of those identities? Yeah.
Well, I mean, intersection is a really key word, right? Because when you grow up, you're dealing with all these different things, and I definitely had to deal with all of that. I think, in terms of, the coming out story, which is part of it, it is part of it. The way I sort of talk to my agent about like how we would, write this book, it's like I said, for the people of color, we're going to talk about racism. For the gay people, we're going to talk about coming out. And for the Jewish people, we're going to talk about Chinese food. So like I said, if I did those things well, then I think I would do fine. And so I was always trying to think of different things of balancing out. Because when you're coming out as a kid, it's not the only thing you're dealing with, right? Just because you're gay, that isn't the only thing. I mean, you're dealing with all this other stuff, right? Particularly if you're Asian in a very black and white city, you're dealing with race. If you're working class and your family suddenly moves to an all-white middle-class neighborhood, you're dealing with class, right? If your family Buddhist and everybody else is, Judeo-Christian, you're obviously out of step in some different place. And so all of it is what I dealt with. And it's interesting how, these things sort of wear their ugly head sometimes. Like I talk about in the book, again, it was the 80s, the AIDS was really terrible. And at that point, I really didn't think I had a very long life. It was really depressing in some ways. But then one night, this this white couple comes into the restaurant and they're just laughing and just having a really great time. And at some point I realized it's actually a man and a drag queen. And I get all excited because I think like, wow, for the first time in my life, I see like joy connected with being gay. And I think like, wow, being gay isn't a death sentence. So I'm like suddenly all, invested in this couple, and I'm being really nice to them. I'm giving them free stuff that my grandmother would totally kill me for. But it's like, I felt like I found my people. And then, as I was bringing their order to the back kitchen, the drag queen yelled across the dining floor, "You better not be serving us dog meat." You know what I mean? So it's sort of like how you just pivot, where it's like you feel like you have your community, and suddenly you're like stabbed in the back. And so I think that's just, that's coming out. I mean, like, there's this other really great story that I love to share. It's like, okay, so one of the things you should know is that back then I was a Republican. Okay, so that's a big part of the book. Like I was the Asian Alex P. Keaton, if that means anything to you people here. Because I felt like, when we moved to the all-white suburb, I felt like the best way to sort of blend in was be like everybody else, was like a Republican. And so like I was senior class president, president of National Honor Society. I co-founded the Young Republic Club, Students Against Smoking. I went to Boys State. Margaret Thatcher was my imaginary girlfriend. It was really awful. And so, and then one night, like, there's this news report about AIDS that comes on, and suddenly caught frozen because I don't want to show too much interest in the story, even though I am interested in it. But my mom is sitting right there, and I don't want her to see me interested in the story because I don't want her to feel like, oh, why is he so interested in it? And so we just had this really interesting exchange, where we're because I also was testing her. Like I would ask her to see how she feels about certain things, right? To see if it was safe to come out to her. And so I asked her what she thought about it, and I'm paraphrasing here, but she just basically says, what's wrong with your president? Why isn't he doing anything, right? And like my president being Reagan, because he was my president, and I said, something to the effect like, what do you want to do? He's busy, he's fighting the Russians, and then my mom just said, like simply, I said, Mom, what do you want him to do? And she just said, help. It's 4-letter words. She just said help. You know what I mean? And it's really shoot me that it was weird that this closeted gay Asian kid was much more like anti-gay than his immigrant Chinese mom, who was much better about this. So it's just I don't know, it's complicated, right? That's life.
That's right. Yeah, I think you said that right. Coming out is not a single act, but an ongoing process.
It's not, and we make mistakes and we fumble through. And that's one thing that people praise me for and write in the book is that I don't necessarily present myself as like this angelic, idyllic kid. But I don't think any of us are at that point. And I also feel like, that's 30, 40 years ago. I can't laugh at myself, have that distance. And what is the point of writing a book, right? Like, I'm not going to present this like, oh, he's a perfect little kid that grew up in Detroit. No, I made mistakes, right? But in hopefully making those mistakes, I figured out who I was, right? And how I got to this point. I'm not a Republican, but it's like how we get to that point of understanding this, right? And you can only provide to that if you're actually honest about this.
Right. Yeah, right. I think that's right. I think this memoir is also it's important even for the young kind of age, but like create a community to sort of read it and then to be able to write to embrace their communities, right? So embrace writing professions. Like it's nothing as Asian kids or Asian, we're all often kind of like someone to be a good student, a good kids, but then it is okay. Yeah.
There's still that there's that that's perennial, right? Like that expectations living up to your parents, particularly you have immigrant parents, right? Trying to make them happy. But I also think that for young gay people, I think it's also hopefully interesting for them to sort of see what it was like to be gay in the 80s and 80s. I mean, that's a much more different generation back then. Because I'm old enough to remember when gay people were still seen really, as I say in the book, we were lumped with pedophiles, the alcoholics back then. We're not seen as protected class back then. And so so much has changed even in my lifetime.
Maybe I will have kind of maybe 2 more questions and then what you the audience. Really many queer individuals really sort of find comfort, actually connections in spaces like restaurants and bars, right? So how do you see these spaces as essential for both community building and even mental health?
How they communicate?
Because so lots of many queer individuals, right? They will find comfort and connections in spaces like restaurants and bars, right? That's where people gather. So how do you sort of see these spaces as essential for community building, even for people, right? To fund communities, yeah.
Do we really find comfort in bars? Is that true?
Well, I guess nightlife. That's what we're trying to, yeah.
Alcohol. Well, I mean, there's this idea of chosen family, which is really important for gay people, because a lot of times gay people are kicked out and not accepted by their family, and so they have to sort of recreate that. I mean, I think that if you're particularly working at a bar, or maybe you're thinking more of the customer, but for me, like that idea of a staff, a team working at a restaurant seems like a chosen family to me. As for customers, being on that other side of the table, yeah, I would guess so because it's not like shopping. at a clothes store or going to the Apple store where you just go in and out, or maybe the Apple store you linger. But when you go to restaurants or bars, you're there for a while. You're there for hours potentially, right? And you start to feel comfortable. You start to feel at ease, particularly if you are a regular, right? Like you're going there, you have your favorite spots and stuff like that. So maybe that's why you integrate that. But I think also anytime you're being fed somewhere, literally fed somewhere, it also brings warm feelings, right? I mean, so I think that maybe that's why it will hold a special place, for the queer community.
And then I want to also maybe, as you mentioned about, right, kind of also throughout your work, right, you've been, right, a long-term activist. So I want to talk about kind of your activism, right? Because you did come to New York, right? Kind of you established the American workshops, right? That's kind of right already sort of bringing us, become more visible, but then during the AIDS crisis, in New York. And I know right now at this moment in time in the United States, right, a lot of us going through some events with the great use, just feeling frustrated, or feel like our identities, our just your own maybe resistance, right, to the state. And a lot of us, right, kind of we want to participate, want to be, kind of be more vocal, want to be sort of like sometimes, right, of I guess me, I'm just speaking for myself, right? Feel sometimes lost, or should I know, right? The one form of activism, rallying, right, protesting, but then there's also other forms of activism, right? I think you've done it through writing, filmmaking, now memoir. Yeah, so just throughout your kind of your life, sort of the lifetime experience of activism, what could you tell, right? Maybe the young queer people of color, or even just, or even just, like the young folks, out there just feeling, frustrated, feel like so small, but then would like to contribute. I mean, to the community. It's
They're frustrated because they don't feel like they can have an impact, or they feel like too much at the same
too much at stake, but also maybe you just don't feel that they have too much of an impact.
Well, I don't understand that part about like them not feeling like they have an impact. I think that
All the ways, like because if I'm right, that's because a lot of us will feel the only thing that we can do. Oh, well, I like activism. Like, what's your kind of definition of activism?
Well, the one thing that I would say to the younger generation of activists is that God, so much has changed in the 50 odd years that I've been alive. I mean, if you think back on like, and you can read this in the book, like how things have changed for gay people during that whole time period. And yeah, this upcoming 4 years might be really, really difficult for people of color and people in marginalized community, but hopefully we're not going to go so far back. Like when it comes to things like marriage equality, if the Supreme Court decides to take that away, like the way they took away, Roe v. Wade, I'm not surprised, right? I mean, because Clarence Thomas has already said that decision was in the Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs decision. He actually cited that. So if we lose it, we lose it. But at the same time, I don't think we're going to go all the way back. I think what they'll do is they'll take away the federal right to marriage and they'll make it a states' rights issue or something like that. But my point is that we've come a long way with all these issues, whether LGBT, racial justice, gender, all these things. That overall we're headed in the right direction, and I think that's what I would sort of focus on. Yeah. But in terms of being frustrated, it's like, I don't understand the frustration, but we are, in some ways, we are winning. It may not feel like we're winning. I mean, it feel like we're losing, particularly with this last election. But overall, trust me, we are winning. I mean, and we will have equality and justice in this country. We keep pushing and we keep fighting. And everybody does their little part to it, I think. Do what you feel most comfortable. And the other thing that I would like to say to young people too is that hopefully they enjoy the successes of the civil rights movements and the LGBT rights movement, because that's why us older people fought so hard, right? And so that young people can have good lives, so you guys can experience, so that you guys don't have to go through the terrible stuff that we have to go through. And it's the sense of doom that we grew up with and stuff like that. We want you guys as younger generation to enjoy the fruits of that success, right? We also want you to remember it, don't forget it, but we also want you to enjoy it too. So just keep moving the ball along, and that's good enough. I don't. So hopefully you guys aren't too frustrated. You guys don't. Yeah.
I think we're doing it in our own way, right? Right, like we all here at the museum, right? Kind of inclusive programming, but then also in I think a lot of us here too. I mean, of course, and the thing is also very social. It's a lot of misinformation, lots of, like online bullying, so it's so hard to like distinguish, like, so, to find unreliable, resources and organization to support.
Yeah.
Restriction here.
Mm.
Okay, my last question is more of a personal question because I am a fan of techno music, and I know Detroit is sort of the birthplace of techno music in the 1980s, and it's very sort of queer and and it's mentioned the AIDS crisis. Were you ever part of it? Did you have any connection to it?
Did I go dancing? No, but the drag bar that was right by our restaurant actually became really famous. It's called the Gold Dollar Bar, and that's where White Stripes got their start. And it's yeah, so that was a hot space, but that was after I left town. And I'm much older than that, so yeah, I'm more of the Motown era. Yeah.
Great, well, thank you so much. So now, yeah, we just open the floor for Q&A. Yeah, if you do have questions, yeah, please raise your hand, and then please actually speak to the camera and the mic. Yeah, and then also for our online audience, yeah, please also submit any questions
So
to.
before you take a question, we do a quick selfie.
Oh, sure.
So yeah. If you follow my Instagram, you'll see I do this at every event. Okay. Oh, yeah. Can you squeeze in? I hope I got everybody. Okay, thanks everybody. Okay, now.
Hello. Hi. Can you tell us more about the gambling that went down in the basement? Start.
What's your name? What's your name?
How did that start? And who's allowed there? And did you have a lookout in case the cops came?
Actually, this is something I discovered because if you guys know On Lam, right? Like in the 70s, the FBI busted up a lot of the Chinese gambling things, right? And so because my grandfather was the head of the On Lam in Detroit, his name and address were in a lot of the files in these other locations. So like when they busted and they took the online building in Chicago, immediately they came to Detroit. And so when I was a kid, the FBI kept like knocking on our door trying to find out like what's going on. But it turns out that you can legally actually run a gambling den as long as the receipts don't reach a certain level. That's why churches can do bingos and stuff like that, right? And so because the Chinatown in Detroit was smaller and because they had these books that didn't look like they were doing that much, you know what I mean? They couldn't arrest my grandfather, So yeah, but it's it's one of those things where like it's like there are different exit ways where you could run out just if the police came, So yeah, it was all that. Yeah. So, but they had everything down there. They had like Pai Gao, they had like mahjong, they had pool tables. It was a happening spot.
So I have a technical question. In the book, many times you translate Chinese phrases phonetic without explanation for those who are not native speakers. And those who are not native speakers or readers will miss the point. Why did you consciously decide not to translate some of those phrases?
Well, hopefully they don't miss it, right? Because actually, this is something that I had to learn because in a writing group, I would actually initially, I would write out the Chinese word and then I would put in parentheses what it was in English, right? And then one of the people in my group, he was like a professional translator. He said, we don't do that anymore because when you put the parentheses, you take the reader out of the situation. So it's better for you to write the sentence in the context so they understand what that word meant. So hopefully I've done that. In terms of if I did a good job with it or not. My editor at Littlebrow also didn't care because they said it's the language that you heard, right? And so for me, because I grew up in this mixed dialogue thing, our workers were Cantonese, and then my grandparents were Toisan, and then my mom was from Point P. So it's like I had three different dialects going on, and so I could never. That's why I don't speak Chinese, or at least that's why I say I don't speak Chinese. But it's because I could never figure out which is which. So I think that that's becoming more common in the sense of you're not centering English as the only language, right? You're trying to capture that real moment, and keeping the reader into that moment as best possible.
Authenticity.
Authenticity, yeah. And hopefully I did a good job. I mean, I don't think that the only one word that anybody's ever mentioned is what is yin yin, which to me is I think it must be a Hoi King, right? It's not. It's grandmother. How do you say grand? Nine nine. Yeah, was that yeah. So that's is it toy sign? Yeah, yeah. See, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. That's what you call my grandma. Well, we call it other things too, right? What?
By itself, grandma, you just, it's a tell of a deal.
Oh, I definitely do that. Yeah, yeah. That was my grandmother.
Hi, I think it is really sweet of you to make chapters and format of a Chinese restaurant. So I wonder what are other you think that are creative little designs that we should.
Well, I mean, obviously did the 888 thing that was, thing, and then just the general idea of thinking of it as like a Chinese banquet, right? Because like you go to banquet, you got savory, you got sweet, and I really want to balance it out, so there are funny stories, there are serious stories, there are thoughtful things. I think those are just basically the things that I thought about, like in writing it. At the end of the day, I wanted to write a fun book, we live in very serious times right now. The way I also said to my agent was like, we live in little silos right now where we don't talk to each other. But Chinese restaurants are one of the few places where you can go in and see someone from a different race, background, and we should take that opportunity to sort of like, talk to each other. And so it's like cover the egg rolls, but stick to the talk on racism. You know what I mean? So I feel like I try to balance that out, right? It's like a funny story, but then it pivots to something that's serious. And then when I do the serious stuff, it hopefully doesn't feel like I'm lecturing or bashing, your head in about some of these issues. So that's what I was conscious of.
Hi. So this is not a question, but this is me like agreeing with what you said. You guys were talking about like activism.
Mhm.
And you're right, actually. Like even though there's so much like areas that we work on, it is really like getting better for the community as compared to like decades. And yeah, you're right, I agree. There's this post, there's a post that I came across like just in social media. Like it's a clip from this like show that I haven't watched. I heard it's good. It's Shogun. So these there are two like characters and they're talking about something, and then one character said to the other, "If you spent your whole life fighting for freedom, you're never gonna."
Mhm.
So I guess the lesson is like enjoy the moment,
Yeah.
enjoy the freedom that we have,
Yeah.
because it's so much better than how it was set to. And I agree. So yeah,
Yeah.
I just agree with that.
Yeah, like the next 4 years are going to be tough. There's going to be a lot of bad policies, but I don't want us all to live in fear and anger and bitterness the next 4 years. I think there's got to be some joy in that, in some ways. And I think like taking a step back and looking at the big picture of the progress that we've made as a country and as a people, and just keep pushing ahead, and ultimately you want to make it political, people are not going to give up power and privilege readily. If we ever thought that was going to take, it's our fault for having that expectation, right? We should always know that, like if you're asking people to give up some of these things, they're not going to just do it easily. So, that's on us if we expect it.
So my name's Adam, and I feel kind of a similar story based off the fact that I guess a lot of what I've learned recently has come from AI by myself, and it's also taught me a lot that I didn't know before. And so I feel a similar story to your story a bit, and there's also the queer side of it. Um, so I guess what my question to you is, what role do you see AI being used?
AI is the enemy. It's interesting because in Hollywood we went through a big strike, and that was one of the things, and the reality is that, for most writing, particularly Hollywood writing, it's very formulaic. I mean, these studios are chomping at the bit to be able to use AI, right? Because the reality is that when you watch films, audiences expect certain things to happen at certain moments. They expect certain lines, right? It's like a comfort food for them, right? And so I think that there are going to be certain types of films, TV shows, books would be totally using AI. but I don't see myself as one of those type of people. I don't think that's the type of things I write. But who knows? Maybe in about 20 years, different. But yeah. I mean, I think it's just part of that idea of taking writers out of the process. So I'm not a big fan of it. So sorry.
What about the opposite side?
The opposite side, meaning what?
How AI can be used for your advantage?
I think for some people and for some careers, it's actually quite useful, right? For instance, some people have jobs where they have to write reports. They don't like to write the reports, right? AI can do that kind of stuff, right? I think for the more perfunctory things, that'll be fine. Like grant making, grant writing, maybe government reports. But I think for creativity, I wouldn't want to rely on it. But that's the hard thing about technology, right? It's like we always want to embrace the latest technology, but there are effects of it. And, we have to ask ourselves as a society, do we always have to embrace the latest technology just because it's available? Like I'll relate this back to the restaurants, right? Suddenly now you have restaurants where you just go in and you just order off a QR code, right? And in LA, we've got restaurants with robots where you don't even interact with the person. You come in, you sit down, you order your thing, and the fucking robot comes brings it out. You know what I mean? I think that's terrible because I feel like for me, part of the restaurant experience is that interaction with the staff. It's someone welcoming you and someone knowing your favorite items, and that's going to kill the whole thing. And for me, I'm willing to pay a few extra bucks more for that human interaction. You know what I mean? It's a place to sort of slow down your day to feel, nourished and stuff like that. And I would hate for restaurants just to be merely transaction, right? If it's just about shoveling food in your mouth, fine, you can do that anywhere. But I think there's a art and cultural thing about going to restaurants that we really need to see go away. So I think it's just something that we have to ask ourselves as a society. It's like, do we really want to get rid of all these jobs, like in, waiters, service people? You know what I mean? Because that is probably where a lot of things are headed, right? Do we need to, as a society, have the latest, quickest, whatever? I don't know.
What if
Are you a robot? You're advocating for them.
no, not at all.
Stop it. Don't bring up these things. Okay.
So what if AI got me to be here for you to talk tonight?
I mean, are you talking about like algorithms and finding things for you and things like that?
However you want to take it.
Again, it's like you have to look at the pros and cons of it, and you have to ask yourself personally, is it something that it's just recognizing that there is a downside to these things. Yeah, we would all like our lives to be easier. Yeah, we would all love technology to make things simpler for us. But sometimes that simplicity sort of removes the nuances and the choice that we get to make in life, right? And so, if it's taking you out of that position of having agency and authority of your own life, then I guess that the question you ask yourself is like, wouldn't you rather be in control of how you're deciding what brings you on a Saturday night, rather than just having an algorithm saying that this is the place you should go?
What if they never had the idea to be here if it wasn't for AI? And AI was actually the reason that caused me to be here tonight. And then what if it wasn't?
Well, I guess again, that's just for you individually. I mean, what is your relationship to how you want to lead your life, right? So, yeah. So would I rather have a room full of people that all came here just because AI told them to come, versus a room of only 5 people who are really passionate about it because they read the book and they saw themselves in it? I'd rather go for the 5. Because for me, it's that conversation.
Thank you. This is about AI. So I know you're being on a tour to go to different Chinese restaurants, with all different waves of immigration. We have a lot more Chinese immigrants coming. Also with different Chinese restaurants, nowadays we have Sichuan, we have Beijing, we have all kinds of stuff. I'm curious to know about your experiences engaging with the newer immigrants, or in your tour, have you ever visited all those restaurants?
Yeah, it was interesting because one of the restaurants I did this past week was actually a Szechuan restaurant and new immigrants. And so we actually had to have a translator during the conversation. Um, so I think it is interesting, but it's also enduring in that sense because one of the things that we did after my dad passed away was we started a scholarship for kids whose parents grew up in the kids who were growing up in the food service industry, right? And so for the last 20 odd years, I've been reading these essays, and it's really interesting how much that story, or the things that my parents taught us are still the same things that these new generation of parents. So I think fundamentally at that level, you still have that immigrant story of coming to America, working hard, owning a business, sacrificing, trying to give more opportunities to their kids. So I think that fundamental story still rings true, and not just for Asians, but for all immigrants. And so that's why I've had people from, Jamaica, people from Poland who come up and said, I feel like I related too, because, my family also came here, we struggle, and so I feel like in that sense, we can relate to each other on that fundamental, but I can't relate to the spicy food. Sorry, I just don't. I don't get spicy food. Oh, just like you taste it. Anyway,
Hi, Curtis, right here. I'm a hardcore foodie,
okay.
and I would totally relate to the title of the book because we had a Chinese restaurant in the 60s
Oh, nice.
on Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn
Okay.
on the Jewish side. And we sold a lot of egg rolls and they loved our spare ribs. But, but our best seller was shrimp toast.
Okay.
And but we didn't sell 10 million egg rolls like you guys did. I want to know your secret.
Well, I do reveal the secret in the book, so I'll tell you what it was. The secret is Jix peanut butter.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I'm serious about that.
I believe.
Okay.
This one. Okay, maybe we take two more. And then, oh, three more. Okay, all right. Oh, maybe let me go. Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much for this. Thank you for writing the book. I came in late, so if we covered this topic, I apologize. You talked a little bit about immigration, and I wanted to ask about your thoughts on othering. There was a phrase in your book that I think me and a lot of other Asian Americans when you say, "Where are you from?
Yeah.
Where are you eat from?"
Yeah.
So I wondered if your position on othering has changed throughout the years. Do you feel like it's going to be a constant, and is that going to be an okay thing? Because by my account, just reading half the book, you're fourth or fifth generation, and at that level, it should be not as other as before. So I was wondering if you've got thoughts on the topic.
You mean how I'm treated or how I perceive these things?
How you perceive and how you're treated as well. Like if you walk around and people say where you're from, and you say LA, but what they were really asking is like where your family ancestors.
You mean, should I get more upset than someone who's a more recent immigrant by these questions? I mean, do I feel?
I guess how do you feel the question, whether you feel upset or whether other people should feel upset? I'm more curious about whether your view on that question has shifted throughout the years, or do you feel question is still just going to continue and it's
Well,
gonna be okay.
I think it will continue. I think it'll always continue. One of the things I do say, maybe I don't talk about this in the book, but I feel like the racism that my great grandfather faced when he first came to this country is in some ways very similar to the racism that I might encounter. Like the same idea of, oh, you're not going to quite fit in, you're different, you've got diseases. Those fundamental stereotypes, right, have endured for these 100, 200 years or whatever, right? So that's not going to change. I always focus on, more importantly, like how is our community, able to respond to these things, right? And I specifically talk about like, again, not in the book, but afterwards, I've thought about these things a bit more as I do these Q&A, is that the status of the Asian American community is that we will continue to always face these, microaggressions, racism, et cetera, right? That's always just going to be part of this. That's what it means to live in a multicultural society, right? We're all from different backgrounds. Inevitably, we're not going to be able to know everything about these other people, right? There is going to be a gap in that. So all I can sort of concentrate is maybe not on what other people are saying to me, but how I'm going to respond to that, and more specifically, how our community respond to these things. And so I sort of compare it like what happened with the Vincent Chin case and what happened with the spa shootings in Atlanta and also the shootings of the Sikhs in Indianapolis that happened right around the same time. Is that, you know, part of the reason these people, the killers, were able to get away with murder in the Vincent Chin case was because our community was not prepared to handle that, right? We didn't have the infrastructure. But when you compare that with what happened in Atlanta, I think that our community has done a really, really good job of pushing back against, you know, the anti-Asian hate that sort of reared its ugly head in the last 5 years or so, right? And I just sort of go off the list of all the things that went wrong in this Chin era versus now. So the first thing is like the newsroom, right? Back then, there were no Asian Americans in the newsroom saying, this is a story we need to pay attention to. And there was no one, you know, pushing that. The past cycle, we have Asian Americans, you know, in the newsroom saying, this is an important story. And not only is it an important story to cover once, but it's an important story to keep covering, right? Over and over and over, right? And that's a critical change. We also have a whole bunch of Asian American celebrities. We didn't have that back then. We also didn't have social media, but now we have social media to sort of keep those stories alive. You know, we have Asian American politicians. We didn't have that before. We have that now. They're able to pass legislation. We have a whole network of Asian American nonprofits that are working on these issues year in, year out, not just cataloging the crimes, but also providing victim services. So it becomes easier for people to sort of stand up, right? We didn't have it back then. We have that now. We have super rich Asian Americans that are actually giving back. You know, we had rich Asian Americans back then, but they didn't give back. Now they're giving back. And so we're actually supporting, you know, Asian American nonprofits and also founding foundations to sort of support these things. We have Asian American studies programs, right, which are actually teaching our history so that it becomes, you know, so that people see us as people. So I look at all these things and I think about like what your question is like, how do I respond to that differently now? I'm fairly optimistic that, you know, yes, racism is always going to be part of society because that's what it means to live in a multicultural society. But we're better at responding to it. And then in terms of how I deal with those particular individuals that might say something racist to me, I talk a little bit about this in the book. There's a difference between, you know, intent and impact, right? Like all racism. So racism is basically as this is what I decided when I was like 15 or 16 years old, is that, you know, there's two types of racism. There's dumb racism and there's mean racism, right? All racism is kind of dumb, but there's a certain type that's mean. And the mean racism is like, go back where you came from, you know what I mean? Or you people, anything that does like that, that's mean racism. I can't deal with it, you know, but the ones that are just dumb because of this ignorance, we have to find a way to work with those people. So like the specific story in the book that I talk about it is like, you know, my parents didn't let us hang out with anybody, right? Because we have to study and stuff like that. But when they found out that we had to have friends to get into college, they was like, okay, you guys can have friends. And so the first time I got to go to a white kid's friend's house, you know, the next day that kid told me, oh, you're the first, my parents said you're the first minority we've ever had in our house. And I suddenly was like, what? Did they fumigate after I left or what? Like, what, you know, why did you bring that up? You know, but then, you know, I just had to like figure out like, what do these microaggressions mean when people make you feel like less than or whatever, right? And so to me, it's like intent and impact is that, okay, they may not have intended to hurt my feelings, but that doesn't, you know, change the fact that it did. And that was the impact on me, right? And if that person, if I push back and if I say to that person, hey, you hurt my feelings, and if they say, well, get over it, then that's a problem. I can't work with that. But if they are apologizing for it and then they're willing to, you know, work that through with me, then I can meet them halfway. So I don't automatically get upset at you know, everything that can be perceived as racism, right? We have to look at case by case and figure out like, is this a teachable moment for both of us, or is this something where I just can't, you know, deal with? And so, yeah, I fully expect that even though my family's been there since the 1800s, I will still encounter a certain amount of racism. You know what I mean?
Thanks for sharing. Yes. Notes.
What is your favorite dish at a Chinese restaurant?
You can't ask that. God, it depends on so much. I know that like whenever I come back here to New York, I think there's some things that for some reason I can't get, you know. Well, okay, I'll say my favorite is in Detroit. We have a dish called almond boneless chicken, which you can't get here in New York. But it's basically white fillet of chicken breaded and then deep fried and put over a bed of iceberg lettuce, served with a bowl of rice, and it's ladled with this really great brown Asian gravy, and it's sprinkled with crushed almonds and like slivers of peacock and mushroom. It is the best. If you ever go to Detroit, you have to go get it. Yeah.
I was just wondering how your siblings have embraced their gay identity. You know, have you all accepted it, or
Well, my sister's lesbian, so she better. Once everybody's fine. I mean, that is one thing that people have asked me is like, you know, in the book, I don't come out to my family, right? And it's not because I edited it out, but the book is chronological. And at that point, you know, where the book ends at the age of 22, I have not come out. So that's why that's not in there. I mean, yeah, no, I mean, I actually think my family in some way likes my husband more than they like me. You know what I mean? Like they always say, like, oh, like whenever they have a question for us, they always contact him and not me. And their excuse is like, well, at least we know where he is. So we don't know what state you're in half the time. So that's you know, but yeah, it's good.